Dear Patriots, before the news starts, please subscribe to our patriotic channel by clicking the subscribe button. Give us a thumbs up to this video. Don't forget to leave your opinion below in the comments section. Share the news on Facebook and Twitter so you friends see it. Thank you.
Trump shows violent video game clips at White House but suggests no actions. President Donald Trump opened a White House meeting with video game executives Thursday by screening a series of clips of extreme game violence, but offered little sign of what he wants to do about such graphic content, which he suggested could be a factor in mass shootings. Trump gathered the video game industry and some of its most ardent critics amid the roiling national debate over gun violence. He's emphasized mental health concerns following the Parkland, Florida high school shooting last month, including the notion that violent video games affect children. Some Democrats, though, say the issue is a distraction from the need for immediate gun control measures. Multiple participants at the White House meeting said that after the screening of violent clips, editors note, graphic imagery, the president gave everyone around the table an opportunity to speak but gave no indication of what steps he might take. He concluded the roughly hour-long gathering by inviting the group for a photo in the Oval Office. The president was asking questions and the president was not showing his hand, other than to say he's very concerned about the violence in some sectors of American society, said Brent Bozell, the founder of the Media Research Center, which takes issue with violent and sexual content in media. I would say he is probably a very good poker player because I couldn't read him at all, said Melissa Henson, program director of the Parents Television Council. Critics of violence in media like Bozell and Henson asked Trump to consider regulation of the video game industry and said the industry's current voluntary rating system does not go far enough to keep violent games out of the hands of children. They were joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, author of Assassination Generation, Video Games, Aggression, and the Psychology of Killing. The fact of the matter is that children should be kept 10 miles away from this kind of ultra-violence, Bozell said. Why not have penalties, just as you do with tobacco, for a merchant who sells it to underage children? Those making the industry's case included Michael Gallagher, president of the Entertainment Software Association, and Pat Vance, head of the Entertainment Software Rating Board. They were joined by two prominent executives, Strauss Zelnick, CEO and chairman of Take-Two Interactive, and Robert Altman, CEO of ZeniMax Media. Trump's brother, Robert Trump, sits on the ZeniMax board. The Entertainment Software Association discussed the numerous scientific studies establishing that there is no connection between video games and violence, First Amendment protection of video games, and how our industry's rating system effectively helps parents make informed entertainment choices, according to spokesman Dan Hewitt. The video game industry has long lobbied against federal oversight of its products, establishing its own regulatory body, the ESRB, in 1994 to label new releases with their appropriate audience from everyone to adults only. It has also maintained that scientific studies have yet to link video games with violent behavior in the real world. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican Florida, and Reps. Vicky Hartzler, Armo, and Martha Roby, Republican Alabama, also joined the White House meeting. Hartzler's office said the Congresswoman focused on her bill, passed in the House late last year, that would allow off-duty and retired law enforcement to carry guns in schools. The president acknowledged some studies have indicated there is a correlation between video game violence and real violence, the White House said in a statement. This meeting is part of ongoing discussions with local leaders and Congress on issues concerning school and public safety and protecting America's youth. Some Democrats called Trump's focus on video games misguided and sought to steer the conversation back to gun control. Focusing entirely on video games distracts from the substantive debate we should be having about how to take guns out of the hands of dangerous people, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat Connecticut, said in a statement. Blaming video games or the entertainment media for the 90 American lives lost every single day to gun violence is an unacceptable excuse to avoid talking about serious policy proposals. Obviously, video games are a problem, but let's not lose sight of the forest for a tree, Senator Bill Nelson, Democrat Florida, said. The bottom line is that we need to get these assault rifles off our streets and require universal background checks on the purchase of every firearm. The president's anti-video game rhetoric pulls from a political playbook that dates back decades. Since the early 1990s, lawmakers have raised alarms about violent video games warping the minds of young people. Since then, games have only become more immersive and realistic, but Washington's attempts to regulate them have led nowhere. In 2011, the Supreme Court struck down a California law banning the sale of violent video games to consumers below the age of 18, saying they qualify for First Amendment protections. Still, the debate tends to flare up in the wake of national gun tragedies, such as the 2012 mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut and last month's killings in Florida. A former neighbor told the Miami Herald that alleged Parkland shooter Nicolas Cruz played video games for up to 15 hours per day. It was kill, 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 blow up something, and kill some more, all day, the neighbor said. John Handel and Ashley Gold contributed to this report. Nationalists win and globalists go home after Trump tariffs. Gary Cohn walked into the Oval Office earlier this year armed with data and economic reports he believed clearly shows that imposing harsh tariffs on steel and aluminum imports would backfire. President George W. Bush tried and failed to do the same thing in 2002 and the fallout could be even worse this time, Cohn argued. And besides, he added, there are far more American jobs in the industries that rely on cheap steel and aluminum than in those that produce the materials. But President Donald Trump was unmoved. You get me 3 different economists and they'll have 3 different arguments, Trump said, according to a person familiar with the meeting, dismissing the facts and figures. Cohn and a White House spokeswoman did not respond to a request for comment. Establishment Republicans and even some Democrats joined the Trump administration last year under the assumption that the president, a political neophyte, would be malleable when it came to key policy issues. But facing an obstinate president backed by vocal advisors who warned him against abandoning his campaign promises, the so-called globalists in the administration never had much of a chance of completely changing the president's mind on issues about which he is passionate. At 71, Trump is stubborn and headstrong, and he has long maintained that waffling is a sign of weakness. The president sees steel workers and other forgotten men and women in rural parts of the country, as he often calls them, as the core part of his political base, and he believes that betraying them would be political suicide as he looks ahead to his re-election campaign, according to aides. The president talked about trade during the campaign, and the people voted for him. States that never voted for a Republican came over into his column, said Curtis Ellis, senior policy advisor at the pro-Trump outside group America First Policies. It's not just a theoretical discussion about economic nationalists versus globalists. It's about what works, and a lot of these globalist policies never delivered as advertised. That conviction has prompted Trump to repeatedly dismiss the advice offered by Cohn, Trump's outgoing director of the National Economic Council, and other establishment figures. Trump's brand of economic nationalism, buoyed by 3 decades of frustration with U.S. trade policy, proved nearly impossible to puncture as Cohn and others sought to argue against the tariffs. Trump's final decision on the tariffs mirrored his move to ignore the advice of Cohn and others, including his daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner, and announce his intention last year to pull the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement. The president has strong views on trade. He is willing to listen to people and cut deals, but he is not going to do a 180-degree turn on one of his core principles, said a former campaign official. Trump unveiled his new tariffs on Thursday surrounded by steel and aluminum industry workers, inviting them to tell their stories during the White House event. When steel worker talked about the hardships he faced after his father lost his job, Trump said, "Well, your father, Herman, is looking down. He's very proud of you." Informed that the man's father was still alive, Trump quipped, "Then he's even more proud." Trump's top advisors gathered around him as he announced the tariffs. Cohn and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, long a close Cohn ally, were reportedly standing in the back of the room, out of the range of the cameras. Among Trump's longtime backers inside and outside the White House, frustration with Cohn and other moderates runs deep. These people regularly complain, in public and in private, about the globalists in the administration, and many of the president's conservative supporters cheered when Cohn announced he would resign. Cohn early on served as a natural foil for economic nationalists like former chief strategist Steve Bannon, who, in a bid to persuade Trump not to waver from his campaign pledges, stoked fears that the New York Democrats would ruin Trump's presidency. Globalists were always a threat to Trump's economic nationalism, a former White House official said, adding that they tried to thwart every move with whining about the corporate tax cuts of the stock market. While Trump has clearly sided with the nationalists on tariffs, Cohn and the remaining globalists believe they've succeeded in moderating some of the president's more extreme impulses. Cohn steered Trump toward exempting some allies from the steel and aluminum tariffs. They have also kept the United States in NAFTA, so far. And Cohn scored perhaps his biggest victory when Congress passed a once-in-a-generation rewrite of the tax code. Outside groups, for their part, are less interested in the economic nationalist versus globalist fights in the White House. We'd rather just look at things on a case-by-case basis. We really don't get involved in labels or call which of those various labels are winning or losing, said Tim Phillips, the president of Koch brothers-backed group Americans for Prosperity, which criticized Trump's tariff decision and praised the tax reform push. Meanwhile, people sympathetic to Cohn's worldview inside the administration say it's not a matter of big wins but rather avoiding even larger potential losses. It's not that Gary won a lot, one administration official said shortly before the NEC director announced his departure. But think of some of the outcomes without him. Nancy Cook and Ben White contributed to this report. U.S. allies go it alone on giant trade pact. While President Donald Trump announced steel and aluminum tariffs Thursday, officials from several of the United States' closest allies were 5,000 miles away in Santiago, Chile, signing a major free trade deal that the U.S. had negotiated, and then walked away from. Trump withdrew from the giant Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, conceived as an effort to counter China's influence, on his first day in office. He called it another disaster done and pushed by special interests during his campaign. The signing of the pact, which includes U.S. trading partners Japan, Canada and Mexico, is extremely timely in the face of protectionist pressures and pressures that could end up in what nobody wants, which is a trade war, Chile's Foreign Affairs Minister Geraldo Muñoz said at the ceremony. The deal, signed by Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, New Zealand, Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, Singapore and Vietnam, symbolizes a major win for free traders abroad. The deal, now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, will cover a market of 500 million people and represent almost 15% of global trade, Muñoz said. Had the U.S. participated, it would have slashed tariffs for American imports and exports with those countries. The message from the 11 countries participating is that they're committed to free and open markets, said Barbara Weissel, the former chief U.S. negotiator for TPP. They see it as an important statement in support of free trade given the actions they're seeing from the United States. All the trade officials at the signing emphasize the importance of free trade, with most adding the deal comes at a time of rising protectionism, although they avoided direct reference to the Trump administration. The protectionist climate was an additional stimulus to move on and do it, even though the U.S. was not present, Muñoz said. We decided it was worth going ahead. The signing occurred as Trump signed an order Thursday imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum imports on most countries, a move that former USTR officials and trade experts have decried as protectionist and potentially triggering a trade war. The tariffs have been widely considered an opening move against China, which is blamed for much of the global excess capacity of steel, even though China is not in the top 10 countries for U.S. steel imports. "It's a shame, if the U.S. wants to target China, we've just taken off the table the most effective tool in TPP," said Madden Kavanagh, who served as a senior advisor to Obama-era U.S. Trade Representative Michael Fruman and is now a principal at lobbying firm Monument Policy Group. TPP was always to get a foothold with the Asia-Pacific, and to be seen as a legitimate alternative to China in terms of providing a platform for high-standards trade in the region. Many of the United States' proposals were kept intact in the deal, meaning that the opening of agricultural trade to Japan, for example, will most benefit Canada and other major agricultural exporters. "Our competitiveness will decline," Darcy Vetter, the former chief agricultural negotiator for the U.S., told Politico. Pact participants have not ruled out letting other governments join after the pact goes into effect. Several other governments, namely China and Colombia, have already expressed an interest in joining, Munoz said. Earlier this year, Trump said he would reconsider joining the pact if it were made substantially better for Americans, comments that were recently echoed by Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Those comments left the door cracked open a bit, but the focus right now seems to be on other issues. "I don't see this as an administration priority," Weissel said. Once 6 of the 11 countries ratify the deal, it will go into effect 60 days later for those countries. Leaders from the 11 countries expressed hope that it will be enforced by the end of the year, but many expect it'll go into the first quarter of 2019.